this is a big deal. You were on Shark Tank. What was that like? That must have been pretty wild.
And people who were dead, who basically died but still had an account, they did better than people who were alive because they didn't touch it. They said it and they forget it.
There's so many people, so many proponents out there that say it will save humanity. And I don't know that I'd go that far, but
It's like this ultimate mix of adrenaline and terror.
why is there a lack on the retirement side? You'd think that they would be focused on that too, no?
A lot of entrepreneurs think that their businesses are actually going to be their retirement, meaning that down the line, they're either going to be able to sell it, which will give them enough to retire on, or they'll have someone else run it and it'll provide enough residual income to, support them in their old age. And if you look at the statistics, that doesn't play out very well.
We're back for another episode. This is the Mike Z podcast, and our guest today has been an entrepreneur for the past 15 years. He's appeared on the TV show Shark Tank, and he also hosts a podcast called The Rogue Retirement Lounge. His podcast focuses primarily on entrepreneurs and self-employed people who, from his experience, are largely woefully unprepared for retirement. Can't wait to discuss that with him. And he also talks about topics outside of conventional 401k investing like cash flowing assets, tax reduction strategies, asset protection, macroeconomics, and other important factors in the retirement equation. Please welcome Matt Franklin. Matt, thanks for being here today, man.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, you got a really cool podcast. There's some great tidbits in there that I had a chance to check out, and I want to pick your brain on some things, and I want to start by this is a big deal. You were on Shark Tank. What was that like? That must have been pretty wild.
Yeah, that was a crazy experience. Have you ever gone skydiving before?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I compare it to skydiving because skydiving is like this ultimate mix of adrenaline and terror. And that's exactly what Shark Tank was like, because they open those doors and you walk out in front of the four entrepreneurs, or is it five? Five. And it's just unbelievably scary. And all the things that you kind of practice and all the things that you think you're going to be able to say, everything just gets wiped out, and then it just becomes this improvisation of terror. And but overall it was a great experience. I got to hug Mark Cuban, and then we got to go back to our Mark, and then we got to do it again, so they got a better shot. So and I got to see kind of the behind the scenes of how reality TV works, and so it was a great experience.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Yeah, Kevin O'Leary, I picture him being extremely intimidating. Trying to pitch him, he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't take any. He pulls all the punches, man.
Yeah, he did not like us. First of all, my partner was interrupting them. He was interrupting the sharks. He was interrupting me. At one point, I literally elbowed him to get him to stop interrupting me. And Kevin hated us. What's her name? Barbara. She really didn't like us. And Damon, he had purchased our product and had worn it. It's a posture correction device, but he had worn our product on the air under his coat in a previous season, and he admitted that he had purchased our product, but he also hated us. Yeah, we did get the deal with Mark Cuban on TV, but yeah, we did not
Really?
kind of, for lack of a better term, yeah, we did not come off as TV stars.
That just must have been so wild, though. Yeah, I can understand the intimidation factor, and maybe your partner. I'm not making excuses for him, but maybe he was just nervous. All the nerves of being in that situation. There's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are unprepared for retirement, and you talk about that in your podcast. Can you tell us why do you think that is? Why these entrepreneurs are self-motivated, they prepare for what lies ahead business-wise. So why is there a lack on the retirement side? You'd think that they would be focused on that too, no?
Well, I've come up with kind of the four main reasons that I've observed, excuse me, why entrepreneurs are so bad at retirement planning. One is just the variable nature of our incomes. Some months we'll have, 20 grand in the bank, and some months we'll have $20 in the bank. So it makes it hard to do regular kind of scheduled contributions to an IRA. Number two is that a lot of entrepreneurs think that their businesses are actually going to be their retirement, meaning that down the line, they're either going to be able to sell it, which will give them enough to retire on, or they'll have someone else run it and it'll provide enough residual income to, support them in their old age. Um, and if you look at the statistics, that doesn't play out very well, and that's a bet in general. Number three, people say that they love what they do and that they don't plan to retire until they're very old. And to those people, I say, well, if you had enough money so you could retire, how much sweeter would it be to do what you love if you didn't have to, and you could really
Yeah.
do it because you love it, not because you needed to put food on the table. And then number four is that when you start a business, nobody tells you about retirement. I've read probably 50 books on retirement, or I'm sorry, on entrepreneurship. I've gone to the seminars, I've paid for coaching and training. Never once was the word retirement planning uttered. So it's like it's this secret thing that nobody talks about and nobody wants to talk about. And so those are basically kind of the four reasons why people who start businesses and who run their own businesses or gig workers or the like are not good at retirement planning.
Would you have put yourself in that category at one time? I mean, clearly you're financially literate. You know a heck of a lot about money and finance now. Were you different in the past?
I would say yes. When I first started, I just I had a 401k rollover from my job, and so I had a little money to invest, and I bought some mutual funds that did very poorly. And it wasn't until a couple of years after I had started my business that I was like, oh, man, I got to get on this because I can't do this forever. So after maybe 2 or 3 years after I started my business, I started really doing research. I started actively like managing what I was buying, and I was buying and selling stocks and doing very poorly in some, and it just became a process of educating myself.
Yeah, it's a little uphill and intimidating at first. I can remember like I had my own holdings, under the care of financial professionals all throughout my 30s. And into
Okay.
my 40s, I had a friend speak to me who was like, why don't you try and do some of this on your own? I mean, it just takes a little reading and education. And I mean, I'm kind of, I should be a little more accurate. He didn't say a little reading. Obviously, it takes a lot to pay
Yeah.
attention to this stuff because, you do
Yep.
a whole pod on it.
Yeah.
But, and I've made mistakes. I've bought things when they were high, sold them when they were low. We all make those little errors in calculation, and, it's hard to time the market. But I think
Absolutely.
if you put yourself into a discipline where you study this stuff and you don't make cowboy moves, you know what I mean? Like go in on all some volatile tech stock, with like your entire life savings. There are strategies, just diversification and things along those lines. And there's so much online, like particularly on YouTube, that, not all of it's good, but there's a lot of good financial channels and just investment advice channels, and different brokers have channels that help people. And there's a
Yep.
lot of resources out there if you look.
Yeah, there are.
You know?
There's also a lot of bad information too.
Yeah,
So
true.
you definitely have to be careful about what information you absorb. But yeah, I mean, when people ask me like where to start, there's a book called The Simple Path to Wealth. I'm sorry, I don't remember the author's name, but there's this book. The whole idea of the book is that you just buy one mutual fund, and that's the VT Sachs, which is the Vanguard S&P 500 index, and that can be your entire lifetime retirement plan because it provides diversification. You got 500 companies that operate all over the planet. It provides aggressiveness because there's technology companies in there, but it provides stability because there's like old energy companies and the like. And that to me is a great way to start because then you're not trading stocks and you're not out there taking risk. And so anyway, the simple path to wealth is an awesome place to start.
Yeah, I remember, was it, Jack Bogle used to talk
Oh
about,
yeah.
isn't he like the grandfather of ETFs, if I'm not
Yeah, yeah. He,
mistaken?
I think he
Yeah.
was the one who kind of came up with the idea of index funds. Yeah. So where you
Yeah.
just set it and forget it.
Yeah, and I remember, I know he died a few years ago, I think now, if my memory's correct, and I remember him in an interview saying, get an exchange traded fund, an ETF, open it, put your money in it, don't look at it for 30 years, and then when you go to open it again, make sure you have a cardiologist with you because you'll probably have a heart attack.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's such great advice because I
Yeah.
had Anthony Scaramucci, the kind of if you recall, he was the White House press
Yeah,
guy
yeah,
on
I
the
know who
show
he is.
for
Yeah.
like 7 days. I had him on
Yeah.
my podcast, and one of the things that he says is that people in Schwab did a study, and people who were dead, who basically died but still had an account, they did better than people who were alive because they didn't touch it. They set it and they forget it, which I find hilarious. And that's just great to remember. Don't get nervous and sell at the bottom. I've done it
Yeah.
myself, and
Yeah.
so but yeah, you just watch it grow, let it grow, let the market do its thing, and time and compounding interest will take care of you.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to look at it. And on a different note, do you think people should pay off their mortgages? We're talking about entrepreneurs in general, before and earlier in our conversation, and they have these fluctuating incomes where they might bring in 30K one month and then like nothing the next month. If they're in a windfall situation, should they just pay off their homes if they're able? Do you think that's something you should just pay over time? What are your thoughts on mortgages?
Well, I was very opinionated about that until rates went up. I was always like, whatever you do, don't pay off your mortgage. Excuse me. Because we lived in this time where we had historically like 5,000 year lows in interest and people were having 2 and 3% mortgages. In that case, if you've got one of those, no, don't pay it off because you can invest and do way better than that and get way better returns. And the half life of money, meaning the amount of time that it takes for it to deprecate by 50%, is about 10 years. So if you've got a 30-year mortgage and let's pretend that your mortgage payment is 2,000 bucks, in 10 years that $2,000 is going to be worth $1,000. And then
Yeah.
10 years after that, that $1,000 is going to be worth 500. And people fail to take into account that a fixed rate mortgage is kind of like what would you call it, rent control. And so 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, your mortgage is going to be a smaller and smaller and smaller percentage of your income, whereas the investments that you made in those first few years of having that mortgage are going to be compounding and doing great for you. So in general, I say no, don't pay off your mortgage. Now, if you've got a 7 or 8% mortgage, now I would say, yeah, you should probably try to do your best to aggressively pay it down.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I mean, if you factor in inflation and you're in a low fixed rate like they were giving out 5 or 6 years ago, that amount is going to sound lower and lower as the
Oh,
dollar loses its value,
absolutely.
which we're seeing.
Yep.
And that's a great perspective. I never thought of that. Great insight, man.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing that we humans really are bad at recognizing is the insidious nature of inflation. Yet we have this little restaurant that we go to down the hill, and the burgers that I was buying for $10 in 2019 are now 16. We fail to recognize the how much inflation eats away at our purchasing power. And but it's a double-edged sword in the case of a mortgage, because you're paying back that mortgage in dollars that are much less valuable as time goes by. So you can use it to your
Yeah.
advantage. And that's another reason why, we talk about the income inequality and the wealth gap. Well, one of the things that protects you from inflation is owning assets, because their value goes up as the value of money goes down. And so one of the most basic things that you can do, even if you don't have the ability to save for retirement, one of the most basic things you can do is have that mortgage, buy a house, and let the value of that grow as the value of the dollar declines.
Yeah. And we've seen that too in the last 3, 4 years. Since the pandemic, home prices here in the US have skyrocketed just about everywhere.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, but I feel for some of the younger populations that are college age right now. Some of them are saying like, "How am I going to be able to buy $1 million house when I graduate?"
Yep.
It's a great place to be if you own assets, but if you're trying to acquire them, it's going to become increasingly difficult, in my opinion. You
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
Yeah. So talk about Bitcoin. I know you've covered digital assets in your podcasts, and Bitcoin is something I believe that is deflationary. It's a fixed supply. So talk about acquiring assets. That's a smart strategy. Many people would say. Do you recommend people include Bitcoin in their portfolios?
Well, this isn't financial advice, but absolutely. I'm obsessed with it. I regret greatly that I bought my first Bitcoin in 2017 and then watched it go down and then sold it at the bottom to lock in my losses. The reason that I did that is because I didn't take the time to do my research. And had I done my research, I would have been smash buying as much as I possibly could. But they in the Bitcoin world, they say you get the price you deserve. And so
Yeah.
I didn't start buying it again until 2021. And when I started back buying it in 2021, it was kind of close to a top. And again, I got the price I deserve, but then I bought it all the way down to the bottom, and I've been buying it all the way back up. And I love the idea of Bitcoin. I love the fact that it's got, there's an economic story, there's a technical story, there's a spiritual story.
Mhm.
It's it keeps me occupied. I spend at least an hour a day either reading about it or listening to podcasts or listening to audiobooks, and the peeling the onion, it never ends. It's really worthwhile to learn about.
Yeah, definitely. What are some of the podcasts you listen to? I'm curious.
What Bitcoin did with Robert,
Cool.
or I mean, Peter McCormack.
Yeah.
What is money with Robert Breedlove. Um, uh, Simply Bitcoin. Uh, let's see, Stefan Livera podcast.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Natalie Brunell, her podcast. Coin Stories. TFTC with Marty Bent. I could go on. There's
Man.
some really good ones out there.
Yeah, you listen to more than I do. That's wild. Yeah, there's so many, like you said, there's so many different aspects to it that the learning is endless. So you can find, like Stefan Livera will talk to a developer for an hour and just talk about potential system bugs and different things that I had no idea existed. And then you get into like Cafe Bitcoin, where you talk about the economic financial implications and just the economic aspects of Bitcoin and yeah, it's a pretty incredible technology. It's a digital asset. It's a store of value, but it's so much more. There's so many people, so many proponents out there that say it it will save humanity, and I don't know that I'd go that far, but I mean, it's a blessing to humanity if you really look at the underlying economics of it.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I'm not kind of a utopian Bitcoiner where I think it's going to stop war and save the world, but I do think that it is perfect money, and I do realize, having learned about actually Bitcoin, having learned about Bitcoin has taught me more about how flawed our current fiat money system is than anything else I'd learned about before. Um, but yeah, I believe that yeah, I don't have the words. It is such a for lack of a better term, it's a beautiful thing, and because of the fact that the the Bitcoin kind of changes your mindset. It lowers your time preference. It makes you think about the future. It makes you want to, it, for lack of a better term, it makes you want to be a better person. It makes you want to
Yeah.
live longer. The study of Bitcoin does so much to enrich you. I and it's so sad because it's kind of like, I know you've mentioned that on your show that you're a Christian, and when you have friends who are not Christian and you want to witness to them, but you just can't get through. I have that struggle with Bitcoin because I want to share that with my friends, and they look at me like I'm an alien, and so yeah, I do love Bitcoin, and I love learning about it, and I will be listening to probably 2 hours worth of podcast about it today.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you no, you're right. And that whole term in the Bitcoin space is called orange pilling
Yep.
people. And I've orange pilled a couple of people. I never
Oh,
thought I
good.
would. So I've
Good.
witnessed to people and they've actually bought it and they've seen, we're at I think we're at 69,000 today at
Yep.
the time of this
69.3.
pod.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's definitely in an uptick right now, and that's a whole nother episode as to why that's happening, and maybe I'll invite you back and we can chat about that.
I'd
But
love to.
you're so right. Like Bitcoin has taught me more about money than anything else. I don't even think I understood money until I understood Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It just opened
Same
my
here.
eyes to so many things. It was like that Matrix, the whole orange pilling thing, right? Like it's like the whole Matrix thing. Do you take the blue pill or the red pill? And I forget which is which, but that opens your eyes and it's like, wow, like my money, my fiat money is becoming less and less valuable as time goes on. And if I just stay this course, I'm going to become more poor. And a lot of people don't grasp that. They just think that Social Security is going to kick in at 65. It's now 67 for people born after, I forget what year.
I think
Um,
1960, maybe 62. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I got to wait to 67. I know that. So I'm one of the lucky ones. But
Uh-huh.
um, but I'm not relying on it either because A, I don't even know if it's going to be here. B,
Yep.
I don't know what it's going to be worth. It's a little bit troubling. And so Bitcoin offers that hope, that you might not have if you're not investing in that and you're stuck in the fiat world. Don't get me wrong. People do really well in the fiat world. We see that. People have
Oh
done
yeah.
great. People are set doing, living in the fiat world. I know people personally who are. So I mean that there's no slam to that. But if you're trying to acquire, and accumulate wealth for yourself, I think it's a good strategy. And I know what you mean. Like, you said you sold in 2017
Yeah.
and the volatility can drive you mental. Like it can
Absolutely.
drive you crazy. So like, when people are watching it, when it hit 15 a couple years ago, people are like, oh, it's over. All the
Hmm.
naysayers come out and say it's done. And now you have BlackRock, starting that Bitcoin spot ETF after the SEC approved it, and all the others followed along after those applications were approved. And clearly, Wall Street sees the value in it, and I think that's only going to cause it to soar even more. I mean, I think we're ahead. We have a real bull market ahead. Not to mention the halving from the cycle
In
from
April.
4 years.
Yep.
Yeah, the halving that we had in April. We'll come back to that. And like
Okay.
I said, maybe another time, but there is some other things I wanted to cover with you because you have such a broad range of topics on your pod. Um, Do you think some people today save too much money for retirement, like money they could have otherwise enjoyed, maybe gone on that dream vacation or traveled more or just lived life a little bit more instead of just, you know, putting everything away, everything they can? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, retirement planning is a very hyper personal thing. And so there's no kind of one answer, but I do think that some people tend to oversave. I know people who are my parents' age who have a ton of money left and they can't enjoy it. And they could have used that money for life experiences when they were younger and not significantly hurt themselves in retirement. There's a book called Die with Zero that's all about, having experiences and, spending money on experiences while you're young. And I think there's a lot to be said for that as long as you're not being irresponsible. The other thing, I have not read the book Die with Zero, but I read an article about it and I talked about it on my podcast. And then I went out and looked up the author, the guy who wrote Die with Zero, who talks about spending your way down to zero. He lives on a yacht. He's a multi millionaire, and that, yes, if you're a multi millionaire, yeah, spend on
Mhm.
experiences, buy that airplane,
Yeah.
go around the world in business class. But if you're kind of on the edge and maybe you're thinking, okay, and I'm going to, you mentioned Social Security, and I'm going to depend on Social Security, I would say don't don't spend too much on your experiences. Maybe oversaving might not be a bad thing because, like you said, you don't know if Social Security is going to be there. Um, so if you, it again, it's a hyper personal thing, but I have definitely seen a lot of people who did oversave, and then they're 85 years old, they're spending all their time at home, and they've got a couple million in the bank, and they're not enjoying it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess maybe that comes from the fear of not having enough.
Oh yeah,
That's such a hard number to factor in. Like, we can all envision that number we need, and there's different calculators online, retirement calculators,
yeah,
but there's just so many factors. We don't know where inflation's going to go. So many different things can happen. You don't know what's in the future, and so it's that trying to be prepared for any circumstance, and maybe they end up overdoing it.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about inflation, but that's another thing that people fail to take into account is that, again, the half life of money. Based on the amount of money that's being printed every year, you can pretty much count on 10 years from now, your money being worth 50% less. So if you're planning for retirement and if you're going to live for 30 years in retirement, you better plan for inflation to eat away 75% of the value of your dollar there at the end, and make that a part of your retirement calculus, because in those retirement calculators it'll kind of default to 2 or 3% for inflation, but you need to pump that number up if you want to get a real idea of what life is going to be like.
Yeah, and a lot of people are overlooking that. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
most people don't even factor in inflation, which is like financial suicide
Yeah.
in retirement planning. I mean, that's got to be the number one thing you look at. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, inflation and taxes. A buddy of mine was talking about he's got a paid off mortgage, and he said, "Well, my number is I just need to make 84 grand a year." And I'm like, "Okay, that's next year. What does that mean for you 10 years from now? And are you planning for that?" And I know he's not planning for it, but you just have to. You cannot underestimate the importance, or overestimate the importance of inflation in your plan.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So, why do you think people just don't take the time to learn about money and how important it is? We all need it. What's the barrier that people are up against when they're trying to learn this stuff?
Well, A, it's boring. People are bored by the topic. B, it's depressing. It can reveal kind of some low self-esteem issues. It can reveal, if you haven't saved, and the numbers are just terrible. If you look at the savings rate of the average 50-year-old in the United States. And so you hit my age, I'm 55, and if you don't have enough saved and you're trying to learn about money, it can be really depressing and it can make you feel bad about the life choices you've made. Um, there's other issues with money, like that it's the root of all evil, and all those kind of negatives that we might have been told about money when we were kids that also might make it like, I don't want, I want to focus on my spiritual path, or I want to focus on my hobbies or whatever. I don't want to focus on money because, I shouldn't be placing so much importance on it. But yeah, overall, I think the main two reasons that people don't learn about it is because it's boring and it's depressing.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. How do you feel about gold as an investment?
Gold. That's funny. I've got a love-hate relationship with gold. I
A lot of people seem to.
Yeah, I was a gold bug. I was a Peter Schiff following gold bug for years. In fact, I carry this American Gold Buffalo in my pocket everywhere I go, which is a 1 ounce, 0.999% 24 karat gold coin. And I
Wow.
and it's cool because it's heavy and
Yeah.
it feels good, and I carry it wherever I go. Um, but I don't. That's the only gold I own, and I sold all my silver. I used to before I was into Bitcoin. I started buying silver bars for whatever reason because I wanted sound money. I sold all that in January and bought Bitcoin. But I think gold is obsolete. I think that if you bought it in the 70s, then you did great. But gold, on an inflation adjusted basis, it's a terrible investment. It peaked at what was it? It was in 1980. Gold peaked, and in today's dollars, that was about $2,700 an ounce. So if you bought gold in the last 40 years, you've lost. You've lost purchasing power. And people always tell you gold is a hedge against inflation. If I turn on late night TV, I'm going to see 20 commercials about buying gold, and
Yeah.
they're all going to say gold is a hedge against inflation. Gold is a hedge against inflation. Historically, that's just simply not true. Gold also is very inefficient. If for me to carry, that's 2,500 bucks. If I wanted to have my life savings in gold, it's going to take a lot to hold that. And where am I going to put
Yeah.
it? And it can get
Yeah.
stolen and it can get lost. Also, gold is very inefficient to buy and sell. The premium that you pay when you go down to your local coin shop to buy gold, you're going to pay 10 to 15% to buy it. And then you're going to pay 10 to 15%, or you're going to make 10 to 15% less to sell it. So gold has to do really well just for you to cover the spread. So I don't really like gold, but also I kind of love gold. So that was kind of a terrible answer, I think.
No, it was a great answer. But I mean, you've obviously turned your attention to digital gold,
Yes.
Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So you still love gold, but in a different form, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Now, what do you think of investing in stocks, individual stocks? Is that something that people should do? Should they just go into, exchange traded funds, ETFs, and let somebody else kind of manage what goes in the basket? Individual stock picks, not I'm not asking you to give into
Right.
individual stock picks, but just what do you think of just investing in stocks for individuals?
I think that if you have the time to do the research, it can be great. And if you really pay attention to what's going on, like from a geopolitical point of view, there's money to be made. I know that I have made some terrible, terrible stock purchases. I bought GM General Motors back in the great financial crisis because it was at a 30-year low. And I thought, well, hey, if GM's at a 30-year low, how can it do anything but go up? And then they declared bankruptcy and I lost everything. Um,
Wow.
so so you can make terrible mistakes. But then also, I watching the news starting in about 2015. Every time I would see a news story about a store like a Sears or a Kmart closing, I'd buy a couple of shares of Amazon stock.
Yeah.
And that I did that for a couple of years and did great on it.
Mhm.
But then when do you sell? And you mentioned the phrase you can't time the market.
Mhm.
So, how long do you stay in? What happens if it collapses? There are so many index funds, whether it's mutual funds or ETFs, that you can buy into where it gives you a cut of the overall market. It's a lot safer and a lot less volatile to just buy these mutual funds. They're very low fee. Like I said, you can get the S&P. If you wanted to, you can get tech focused or AI focused, or
Yeah.
like Kathy Wood's ARK Invest. There's innovation focused funds. um, I if I were making a recommendation, I would say you're probably better off, unless you've got a lot of time on your hands, to buy ETFs and mutual funds in that are based on indexes.
Yeah, definitely. As Jack Bogle once said, they just continue to grow if you pick the right ones, especially, tech focused stuff can be a little more on the volatile side, so that can be a little harder to stomach sometimes, Nasdaq based
Absolutely.
stuff. So it's whatever the investor has that risk tolerance for. Um, what do you think of ESG? That's a very controversial topic. Republicans and Democrats have been fighting over that, whether it should be included in prospectuses, portfolios. What are your thoughts on that? And can you define it for us too?
Oh yeah. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance, and basically it's a way to score a company's behavior. And so environmental, clearly, it's if you're being good to the environment, or if you're creating products that are good to the environment. Social is kind of how you treat your employees. Um, Governance might be your compliance with local or federal laws or whatnot, and then your executive versus your non-executive pay. So, like for instance, I did a podcast episode about this a couple of years ago, and the S&P ESG scores came out, and Tesla had been taken off the list. And but Tesla has been responsible for making more electric cars, and by all intents and purposes, you would think that that's, from an environmental perspective, a good thing. But they were
Yeah.
pulled from the list, and then I looked at other companies that were on the list. There was the Marathon Oil, Phillips Petroleum, and Valero. So there were these oil companies that were on the list, but Tesla was
Mhm.
off the list. And then if social is part of the score, also Caesars was on the list. So a company that makes all its money off gambling. Whether or not you have an issue with gambling, I
Mhm.
might have a problem with that, but apparently that's not a problem from a social perspective. So
Yeah.
whoever's scoring these probably doesn't reflect my values. And that being the case, I think ESG is really bad, for lack of a better term, because um, and unless someone is right in lockstep with me, I'm not gonna buy companies that they deem ESG compliant. So, and I think also, I think that it was a trend, and now I saw a graph come by in one of my newsletters that I get, where mentions of ESG on earnings calls are down to kind of the lowest they've been in like 5 to 8 years, I think. So
Really?
yeah, it's becoming less and less of an important thing, because I think people realize that it's kind of a scam, and it's not helping these companies really help make the environment or the world a better place.
Yeah, I think it's highly politicized. Elon Musk is, I'm a fan, but he's a very polarizing figure, and people like him, people attack him. He says some things that ruffles feathers. I kinda like that. I like his cowboy attitude. I think the business world needs more Elons, and, I mean, look at all that he's done, right? I mean, he's an innovator in the true sense, but I just
Absolutely.
wonder if the powers that be in the ESG space don't like him, so they you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I could never
Yeah.
prove that. It's just conjecture, but, um yeah, I just think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't see. And I've heard similar things. I've heard like Tesla got pulled off and companies that, like you said, oil companies, tobacco companies have scored higher. Like, really?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, if it makes you feel better, like if you're the Harvard endowment and you need to have companies on your balance sheet that are high ESG scored companies, if it makes you feel better, go for it. But my recommendation is do not buy a stock in a company based on its ESG status.
Yeah, I'm 100% behind that as well. What do you think about retiring abroad? Do you think Americans are wise to do that if they can find a place to live that's cheaper and have a good quality of life? Do you think that makes financial sense for people?
I think it makes great financial sense. I mean, I regularly read stories about people who retire in Latin America and Asia. One guy that I follow, oh, I'm terrible with names. Andrew, he has a podcast called "The Worst Investment I Ever Made," and he lives in Thailand, and he takes care of his elderly mother. He got her over there too, and he's living for pennies on the dollar over there and getting great medical care, awesome food. He has a great apartment. I had a guy named Tim Leffel on my show who writes about living abroad, and he bought a house in a town called Guanajuato, Mexico,
Yeah.
and for the price that he was paying just for his mortgage in Florida, he is able to live and pay all of his bills in this town in Mexico. And there's great health care, great food, great culture. So if you can, it's awesome. The problem is that most of us are locked in to family and friends and community. And I love the idea of living abroad, and my girlfriend and I have talked about it many times. But it's like, how do you break the chains of your friends, family, and community, and then just leave? And if you're a 12-hour flight or four connections away, how do you get back home when you need to? It raises a lot of questions. I understand that Mexico, in parts of Mexico, have great health care. I
Mhm.
understand that Panama has great health care, but my Spanish language might not be so great. So how well could I
Yeah.
communicate with the doctor? No matter how great he is, is the communication barrier going to cause problems?
We were talking about living abroad and just, people breaking away, being able to break away from family and their communities. And, you know, I've looked over the fence at Latin American countries and fantasized about, you know, taking my family there or retiring there one day. I mean, it can be an amazing decision for a lot of people, and they can live for less. But you're right, the community that goes a long way. Like, one of the hardest things for me would be leaving the church that I'm a part of right now because
Okay, right.
it's an extended family to every member of my family. So that kind of stuff would be very difficult for me to just walk away from. Not to say I'll never do it, but community is important too, and that's an important part of people's lives and can elevate the quality of your life. Now, that being said, I have never been to any Latin American countries. The closest I've ever been was Aruba, which is just kind of on the tip. But from what I understand, it's a very social culture. So if people did move down there, it seems like it might be a place where it's easier to build a community than maybe a lot of parts of the United States. Just a thought, but you know,
Yeah, no, that's definitely possible. But then there's also the language barrier
right.
too,
Yeah.
and a lot of us, I mean, I took Spanish in high school, I took Japanese in college. And when I'm in Mexico, I can barely ask for the bathroom. And it's worse when I'm in Japan.
Mhm.
Um, but and it's harder to learn a language when you're older. So when you start
Yeah.
talking about retiring abroad, then it's like, wow, what kind of a commitment is it going to take for me to get even kind of somewhat marginally fluent in the local language?
Yeah.
And and then how much is the language barrier going to cause that ability to form community to be, impossible? So yeah, there's a lot to think about. But I mean, when I read stories about people, and like that guy, my guy Tim Leffel, I mean, he he loves living abroad. He's kind of a disenchanted American. He sees everything going on, and uh, he really loves the experience. And if you have moved around a lot, if you don't have that community, if you don't have that family that's holding you back, there are so many options out there and so many ways to really save a buck. I highly recommend it if you can, but very few of us really can.
Yeah. So talk about your podcast, The Rogue Retirement Lounge. I've checked it out. It's really good. How can people find
Thank
it?
you. It's just if you can spell the word rogue, I didn't realize how uh, when you start a podcast, you should think of things like, wow, do people know how to spell rogue? Um, so and I was listening to George Gammon's Rebel Capitalist. I love the name the Rebel
Yeah.
Capitalist. I thought that was cool. So I thought, what would be a good name for a podcast that's kind of about alternative investments and doing things differently. But yeah, so the podcast is called the Rogue Retirement Lounge, and Rogue is spelled Rogue. And yeah, I have been very bad about putting out episodes though lately. I've been working a lot, and that's been hindering my ability to do the show. But I cover a lot of stuff. Like I've talked about ESG. I've talked about things like buying investment properties. One of the big things that I talk about for us self-employed people is solo 401ks and self-directed IRAs, which are a great way to kind of beat the system tax-wise. And all those boring things that nobody wants to talk about, like health savings accounts. I I love the health savings account. It's the best tax advantaged way to save money there is, and nobody wants to talk about it,
Mhm.
but I love talking about it. So yeah, rogueretirementlounge.com. Anywhere you find podcasts, that's where you can find the.
I'll make sure to include that in the show notes. And I know you're right. People think money's a boring topic, but not for me, man. I could talk about this all day long, and I'm going to be bugging you to come back to chat with us some more.
Anytime. I love talking about this stuff. So and like I mentioned to you before we did the show, I like your show because you ask good questions. And so anytime you want to have me back, just call me up.
100%, man. Thanks for being here, Matt.
Thank you.
That'll do it for this edition. You guys know where to find us, MikeCPodcast.com. Click that like button, click that subscribe button, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
The Mike C Podcast.